2,000 years ago, long before the iconic image of the Viking warrior was carved into history, Scandinavia existed as a world caught between silence and struggle. The land was raw, untamed, and indifferent to human life. It was a place where survival was not a given but a daily negotiation with nature. Cold winds shaped the rhythm of the seasons, and thick forests stood like ancient guardians, offering both shelter and threat. The people who lived here did not yet have the ships that would carry their descendants across oceans. Their world was smaller, but no less demanding. In fact, it was arguably harsher. Every breath, every harvest, every winter night was a reminder of how thin the line between life and death truly was. To imagine their world, you must first imagine the land itself. Scandinavia, 2,000 years ago, was not as populated nor as connected as it would eventually become. Large portions of the landscape were covered in deep, shadowed forests, where towering pines and ancient oaks tangled over the ground. In the lowlands, thick bogs stretched for miles, their surfaces deceptively calm, hiding centuries of fallen branches, ancient offerings, and the remains of those who misstepped. Beyond the forests lay rocky coastlines carved by glaciers long gone, where icy waves battered the shore and carried the distant smell of salt and storms. Inland, lakes shimmered with cold, clear water, and rivers snaked through the terrain like silver veins. Though beautiful, this land was profoundly unforgiving. For the people who lived here, life was shaped directly by this environment. Settlements were small, scattered, and often isolated from one another by long stretches of wilderness. A single journey between villages could take days of walking through forest paths, over uneven terrain, past predators, and under unpredictable weather. Families lived close together, bound not only by blood, but by the simple truth that every pair of hands mattered. Everyone had a role. Children learned quickly, elders shared knowledge, and adults carried the weight of survival on their shoulders. Winter was the force that defined the entire year. It lasted longer than the warm seasons and arrived like an unstoppable tide. By the time the first frost touched the ground, people needed to have their food stored, their tools repaired, their animals sheltered, and their firewood stacked high. Winters brought not just cold, but darkness, days where the sun barely climbed above the horizon, if it appeared at all. Nights stretched endlessly, pressing down on the mind and spirit. Firelight was not just warmth, it was life, and in these months, the world outside the longhouse felt like a place inhabited by spirits and shadows. But before winter's arrival, the land offered its short but precious window of abundance. Spring and summer transformed the world into something gentler. Snow melted to reveal patches of green, rivers thawed, and wild plants returned. Berries, herbs, and edible roots flourished briefly. Animals were more active, and the forests echoed with the sounds of birds and insects. Families worked from sunrise to sunset, knowing that every hour counted. Children collected firewood, women prepared food and tended to animals, and men repaired tools, hunted, and farmed. These months were intense, but they represented hope, the possibility that the coming winter could be endured. Although nature dominated their lives, the people of Iron Age Scandinavia were far from primitive. They understood their environment in ways that we can only imagine today. They knew which plants could cure pain, which woods were best for building, and what signs in the sky predicted storms. They recognized the shifting behavior of animals and the subtle changes in rivers and forests. Every sound meant something. Every smell was a clue. Every change in the wind carried a message. They lived attuned to nature's rhythms because any disconnect could be fatal. Their knowledge was not written down. It was spoken, demonstrated, and passed from one generation to the next. Skills were learned through watching, trying, failing, and trying again. A child might spend years mastering the art of lighting a fire in damp weather or learning how to read the landscape to avoid bogs. These skills formed the heart of survival. They were as essential as food and shelter, and they formed a shared identity, a cultural memory carved into the minds of the people by centuries of experience. Society itself was tightly knit. Families did not live as individuals scattered across the land. They formed clans, extended groups that shared ancestry, responsibilities, and a sense of belonging. These clans protected each other, celebrated together, mourned together, and survived together. Loyalty to the clan was not optional, it was essential. A person without a clan was vulnerable, exposed to hunger, enemies, or the merciless environment. Within the clan, however, strength was found in unity. Decisions were made collectively, often led by elders whose wisdom was respected, even revered. These elders understood the cycles of nature, the spirits of the land, the stories of their ancestors, and the lessons carved by centuries of hardship. And spirits, or at least the belief in them, were everywhere. The people saw the world as alive with unseen forces. Forests had their guardians, rivers their secrets, mountains their watchers. Storms were more than just weather. They carried the will of beings far beyond human control. Offerings were given to maintain balance, to show respect, to seek protection. Sometimes these offerings were simple food, tools, or crafted objects placed in bogs or buried in the earth. Other times they were far more significant. In rare instances, entire weapons, ornaments, or even human lives were given to the wetlands, believed to be sacred gateways between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Modern archaeologists uncovering these bogs today are often stunned by how well preserved everything remains, preserved by the land as if time itself paused. In this world, fear was not constant, but awareness was. People understood that the land could turn hostile without warning. A sudden storm could wipe out crops. A harsh winter could starve a settlement. A disease could spread quickly in cramped longhouses. A hunting trip gone wrong could leave a family without meat for weeks. And so, caution and preparation became woven into daily life. The people were not reckless adventurers. They were thoughtful survivors shaped by the demands of their world. Despite these challenges, there was beauty too. Imagine standing at the edge of a lake at dawn, mist rising from its surface, the world quiet except for gentle ripples. Imagine the sound of axe blades striking wood, rhythmic and purposeful, as families built homes from the very trees that surrounded them. Picture the way firelight flickered across the walls of a longhouse at night, illuminating faces as stories were told, stories of ancestors, of spirits, of battles, of journeys, of harsh winters survived against all odds. These moments carried warmth and meaning. They gave people strength and identity, and although they lived in what we would consider isolation, communication did exist. Trade routes, scattered and slow, connected them to neighboring tribes and distant lands. Through these routes came new ideas, new tools, and occasional glimpses of a world beyond the forests and fjords. But most people would never see that world. Their lives were rooted in the land they knew, shaped by the seasons, bound by family, and guided by traditions that stretched back countless generations. 2,000 years ago, Scandinavia was not the land of raiders and explorers it would later become. It was a land of quiet resilience. The people who lived there were not warriors in the way the future Vikings would be. They were survivors, individuals who carved life out of a difficult landscape, who understood nature deeply, and who found meaning in simplicity, community, and endurance. Their world was colder, darker, and more unpredictable than ours, yet they lived with purpose, with strength, and with a profound connection to the land that held their lives in its hands. Every challenge they faced shaped the character of the generations that followed. The resilience they developed, the resourcefulness they mastered, and the unity they valued became the foundation for the Scandinavian cultures that would rise centuries later. Before the longships and the sagas, before the legends of Odin and Thor fully formed, before the world came to know the Norse, there were these people, silent, patient, determined. They survived because they understood their land, respected its power, and worked tirelessly to adapt to it. In their struggle, they laid the earliest stones of a history that would one day inspire curiosity and admiration across the world. Their story reminds us that history is not merely built by those who conquer, explore, or rule. It is also built by those who endure, those who face the bitter wind, the long night, and the freezing cold and still rise each morning to build, to harvest, to hope, and to live. In their survival lies a different kind of heroism, quiet yet profound, shaped not by glory but by perseverance. Life in Iron Age Scandinavia revolved around the land, not by choice but by necessity. Every person who lived there, child, adult, elder, understood that survival depended on understanding the soil beneath their feet, the seasons in the sky, and the animals that roamed around their homes. Farming was not merely an activity, it was a relationship, a constant exchange between human effort and the unpredictable mercy of nature. Without farming, there was no food, and without food, a single winter could wipe out an entire settlement. So the people who lived here 2,000 years ago shaped their daily lives around the rhythms of agriculture and the constant work it demanded. In those days, farming was far from the modern image of fields stretching endlessly in neat rows. Instead, Scandinavian farms were small clearings carved out of dense forests. The land did not offer itself willingly. Men and women worked tirelessly to cut down trees, remove heavy roots, and prepare the earth for planting. It could take years to create a single usable field. Even then, soil quality varied. Some valleys offered fertile ground, while others were stubborn, rocky, and thin. The people learned to adapt, making the best of whatever the land gave them. They cultivated hardy crops, barley, rye, and oats, plants chosen for their ability to endure cold temperatures, poor soil, and short-growing seasons. These grains were not luxuries, they were the backbone of survival. Barley was especially important. It grew quickly, resisted the cold, and provided food that could be stored long after the harvest. Barley became bread, porridge, and ale. Rye was tougher but dependable, and oats served both humans and animals. The entire year revolved around growing and preserving these crops. Planting began the moment the soil softened after the long winter, often in late spring. Families rose before sunrise, tools in hand, and worked the fields with unwavering determination. There were no spare hands. Children helped gather stones to clear the fields, while elders supervised, offering wisdom about soil, weather, and timing. Planting was a delicate balance between hope and memory, hope that the coming season would be kind, and memories of years when frost or storms destroyed entire harvests. The land was not simply planted and left alone. It required constant attention. Weeds needed pulling, pests needed to be kept away, and animals needed guarding. Fences of wood, stone, or woven branches often surrounded fields to protect them from wandering livestock or wild creatures. A single animal breaking into a field at the wrong time could ruin months of work, so people rotated watch duties, staying aware of tracks, scents, and changes in the environment. They read the signs of nature like a book, cloud movements, shifts in the wind, the behavior of birds, because even the smallest clue could predict a coming storm or unexpected frost. Harvest was the most important time of the year. When the crops turned golden, families worked from dawn until the last flicker of dusk. Cutting grain by hand with iron sickles was slow, demanding work. The stalks were gathered, tied into bundles, and carried to storage buildings or carefully hung inside longhouses. Nothing could be wasted. Even the straw was used for bedding, roofing, weaving, or feeding livestock. The grain itself had to be dried, ground, and stored with precision. Moisture was a threat. A damp storage space could lead to mold or rot, destroying food supplies needed for winter. People built granaries raised above the ground to protect grain from animals and moisture. Every family knew that the amount of grain stored at the end of autumn often determined who would survive the winter. But farming was only part of the story. Iron Age Scandinavians depended heavily on their animals, not just for food, but for warmth, clothing, transport, tools, and trade. Each animal served a purpose, and families treated their livestock as essential partners in survival. Cattle provided milk, meat, hides, and manure for fertilizing fields. Sheep were valued for their wool, which was spun into yarn and woven into warm clothing. In such a cold climate, wool wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Goats offered milk and meat, and pigs were prized for their adaptability and ability to forage in forests and bogs. A single pig could feed a family for weeks if preserved properly. Horses, although less common than other animals, were status symbols and vital for transportation. They made travel, trade, and communication possible in a landscape filled with rugged terrain and long distances. Keeping animals alive through winter was an equally demanding task. During the warm months, livestock grazed in open areas or forest edges. But as winter approached, families gathered hay, leaves, and dried plants to create a stockpile of winter fodder. Cutting grass with iron scythes and drying it in the open fields was a major seasonal chore. Homes often included stalls inside the longhouse where animals could shelter from the cold. This wasn't done out of sentimentality. Animals generated body heat, and in a world where temperatures dropped brutally low, every source of warmth mattered. Milk played an important role in daily diet. It was turned into cheese, butter, and fermented drinks. Meat was eaten sparingly during the year, but became essential during certain seasons. The slaughter of animals was timed carefully, usually in autumn, when animals were fattest and before winter made feeding them difficult. Families preserved meat by smoking, drying, or storing it in cold environments. Fish, too, were crucial. Rivers, lakes, and coasts provided a reliable source of protein. Nets, traps, and hooks were common tools, and fishing knowledge was passed down through generations. In some regions, whole communities relied on fish as their primary source of food. Foraging also played a significant role in survival. Women and children often ventured into forests to gather berries, mushrooms, nuts, and edible plants. Berries were boiled, dried, or turned into thick pastes for winter. Herbs were gathered for seasoning, healing, and rituals. Mushrooms, when dried properly, could last months. Even tree bark, especially from pine or birch, could be ground and mixed with flour to stretch bread supplies during times of scarcity. Nothing edible was ignored. Knowledge of the forest's offerings was extensive, a living encyclopedia of plants, seasons, and uses. Their relationship with the land was deeply intimate. People understood the difference between fertile soil and barren earth. They recognized the subtle signs of plant growth, animal behavior, and weather patterns. Before planting, families often tested the soil by hand, feeling its moisture, texture, and temperature. Women were especially skilled at reading the health of crops, knowing which weeds threatened growth and which insects signaled trouble. Men monitored the strength of fences, the presence of predators, and the conditions of grazing ground. Everyone participated in gathering food, tending fields, and caring for livestock because survival depended on collective effort. food preparation was equally important. In longhouses, fires burned almost constantly. The hearth was the center of daily life, used for cooking porridge, boiling stews, baking bread on stone slabs, and smoking fish or meat. Meals were simple but nourishing. Bread made from barley or rye, thick soups filled with vegetables and grains, milk, based foods, occasionally meat or fish, all combined to sustain families through demanding work. Herbs added flavor, while wild fruits offered sweetness during the summer months. Children learned early how to churn butter, grind grain, and tend fires. These were not chores but rituals of survival. The seasons shaped every aspect of this rhythm. Spring brought hope but also anxiety. If the winter had been harsh, food supplies might be dangerously low. If planting was delayed by cold weather, the entire year's harvest could be at risk. Summer brought relentless labor, days that began with the rising sun and ended only when the sky darkened. Autumn was a race against time, filled with harvest, preservation, and preparation. Winter was the test, a long stretch where the success or failure of the previous seasons became clear. Yet for all its hardships, farming life also brought moments of community and quiet joy. Harvest gatherings allowed families to work together, share stories, and strengthen social bonds. Meals eaten after a long day in the fields felt deeply satisfying. The sight of healthy crops growing under the sun gave people strength. The birth of new animals in spring brought excitement and hope. Even the simple act of sitting by the fire, watching snow fall outside, carried a sense of gratitude when the stores were full. It's important to understand that farming in Iron Age Scandinavia was not just about food, it was about identity. Land ownership, however small, was tied to social status. The ability to feed one's family signified competence and leadership. Those with larger herds or more fertile fields often became influential figures within the community. Farming shaped culture, belief, and daily routine. It created the structure by which time was measured: sowing, tending, harvesting, storing. These cycles repeated year after year, generation after generation, building a sense of continuity and belonging. Tools made from iron transformed this relationship with the land. Before iron became widespread, farming relied on wooden or stone tools that could break easily or wear down quickly. Iron-tipped plows cut into soil more effectively. Iron sickles sliced through grain with ease. Iron axes cleared forests that stood in the way of expansion. These tools gave families the ability to shape their environment more deeply than ever before. But even with iron, farming remained physically demanding. Men and women alike bore the scars of the fields: calloused hands, aching backs, and muscles hardened by relentless labor. In a world where farming determined survival, knowledge was as valuable as any tool. Families taught their children how to read the weather, how to rotate fields to avoid exhausting the soil, how to store grain safely, and how to predict which crops might fail. They taught them how to judge the health of livestock, how to treat common illnesses, and how to identify plants that could help during sickness or hunger. This knowledge was not written. It lived in memory, passed down through stories, observations, and shared experience. But life on the land also carried uncertainties that could turn a good year into tragedy. A single storm could flatten fields. A summer drought could reduce harvests to almost nothing. A harsh winter could kill livestock. Disease could sweep through communities or wipe out herds. A poor harvest forced families to ration food carefully, sometimes skipping meals or grinding bark into their bread to stretch supplies. Hunger was a familiar enemy, one that ancient Scandinavians feared far more than human conflict. To fight against this unpredictability, communities developed various strategies. Some families diversified their food sources by hunting, fishing, and gathering. Others stored extra grain whenever possible. creating a buffer against bad years. Families traded with neighbors or different settlements, exchanging surplus goods for what they lacked. In coastal areas, people relied more heavily on fish, which could be dried and smoked in large quantities. Inland communities might focus more on livestock or hunting. This diversity increased resilience. If one source of food failed, others might compensate. Still, even the best strategies could not guarantee survival. Winters tested everyone's strength. Families huddled inside longhouses, sharing warmth with their animals. The smell of hay, smoke, wool, and people filled the air. Meals became smaller, and every portion was measured with care. Days passed slowly, marked only by the tending of fires, the feeding of animals, and the steady hope that the stored food would last. Children learned early that winter was not simply a season, it was an adversary. And those who survived it gained a deep respect for the balance between land and life. Life on the land, with all its challenges, shaped the spirit of these people. It made them resourceful, tough, and deeply connected to nature. It taught them patience, discipline, and cooperation. It taught them humility in the face of forces beyond their control, and it taught them the importance of working together as families, clans, and communities. Every seed planted, every animal born, every meal shared was part of a larger cycle, one that connected past generations to the present and shaped the future of those not yet born. In this way, farming was not simply labor, it was a legacy. It defined who the people of Iron Age Scandinavia were. It shaped their values, their beliefs, their traditions. It taught them to endure scarcity and cherish abundance. It grounded them in the land and prepared them for the centuries ahead. Before the world knew Vikings, before longships sailed across seas, before sagas were carved into memory, these farmers lived quiet, determined lives shaped by soil, seed, and survival. Their endurance formed the foundation of everything that would follow. Iron was more than just a material in Iron Age Scandinavia. It was the quiet force that transformed survival from a daily struggle into a skillful negotiation with nature. Before iron entered their world, the people living in these northern lands relied on tools made of stone, wood, bone, and antler. These tools had carried their ancestors through the Stone Age and Bronze Age, but they came with limits. Axes dulled quickly, blades chipped, and plows often splintered in the unforgiving soil. When iron arrived, not suddenly but gradually, it reshaped everything. It seeped into their daily routines, altered their capabilities, strengthened their confidence, and gave them new ways to manipulate the land that had always challenged them. To understand Iron Age Scandinavia, you must understand just how transformative this metal truly was. 2,000 years ago, Scandinavians were not mining deep underground the way later civilizations would. Instead, one of the most important sources of iron came from the wetlands, bog iron. These wetlands, which outsiders might see as murky and hostile, were valuable to the people who lived alongside them. Beneath the surface of these bogs, iron-rich bacteria collected particles of iron from groundwater and slowly formed lumps of reddish-brown iron ore. Families and clans knew where to look for it. The knowledge was not random. People understood which bogs produced good ore and which did not. They looked for certain colors in the soil, certain textures, and the presence of specific plants that hinted at iron-rich deposits below. When the time came, men and older boys waded into these wet, cold bogs, feeling with their hands or simple tools for lumps of ore hidden just beneath the surface. Extracting the ore was only the beginning. The raw material had to be cleaned, dried, and prepared. It was not glamorous work. The ore smelled of wet earth, moss, and decay. It stained the skin and lingered in the air long after it was collected. But to the people of the Iron Age, this ore held potential, the power to create tools that would last longer, cut cleaner, and opened new possibilities. Families sometimes stored the ore in piles near their longhouses or workshops, letting it dry in the sun before processing it further. Smelting iron was a skill that took years to master. It required knowledge passed down through generations, experimentation, and a deep understanding of fire. Iron did not melt easily. A simple campfire was not nearly hot enough to transform ore into usable metal. Instead, people built furnaces, small, clay structures that could withstand intense heat. Charcoal was stacked inside along with the bog iron, and air was pumped in using bellows crafted from wood and animal hides. This air fed the fire, raising the temperature high enough to reduce the ore into a spongy mass called a bloom. The smelting process was delicate. Too much air, and the iron became brittle. Too little, and the ore failed to transform. The blacksmiths who controlled these furnaces were respected figures within their communities. They were craftsmen, problem solvers, and innovators. In many ways, they held a kind of quiet authority. People depended on them for tools, weapons, and repairs. They understood fire the way farmers understood soil or hunters understood the forests. Working with iron was dangerous. Sparks flew, heat scorched the air, and fumes filled the workshop. Yet blacksmiths shaped metal with confidence, folding it, hammering it on stone anvils, reheating it, and cooling it again. Every strike of the hammer echoed in the settlement. The sound meant progress. It meant preparedness. It meant survival. From these workshops came tools that changed everything. The iron axe, strong and durable, became one of the most important tools in daily life. With it, people could cut trees more efficiently, build homes faster, and gather firewood more easily. Before iron, cutting a tree could take hours or even days. With iron, it became manageable. This wasn't just convenience. It was the difference between having enough firewood to survive winter or freezing in the dark. Iron knives and blades improved food preparation, hunting, and crafting. Sickles with sharp iron edges transformed the harvest season, allowing families to gather grain faster and with less waste. Iron allowed for better plows, which cut into the soil more deeply and effectively. This meant families could cultivate land that had once been too stubborn or too rocky for farming. New fields were opened, food production increased, and communities grew. Iron tools made people more capable of shaping their environment. They could clear forests, build fences, repair structures, and carve wood with greater precision. Each iron tool represented dozens of hours of labor, from ore gathering to smelting to forging, but the outcome was worth every moment. Weaponry also saw transformation. You must remember that although Iron Age Scandinavia was not yet the world of Vikings, conflict still existed. Clans occasionally fought over territory, resources, or honor. Wild animals posed threats. Defense was necessary. Iron spearheads, axes, and small blades offered protection that stone or bronze simply couldn't match. A well-made iron weapon could last for years, even decades. It could turn the tide in battle or defend a family against predators in the forest. Warriors who carried iron weapons felt more confident, not because iron made them invincible, but because it gave them a reliable tool to defend themselves and their loved ones. Still, iron was valuable, and not everyone owned large quantities of it. Tools and weapons were precious, repaired repeatedly, and passed down through generations. When something broke, it was taken back to the blacksmith. Iron was hammered, reshaped, and reforged until it served new purposes. A broken knife might become a small chisel. A damaged axe blade might be reforged into a smaller tool. Nothing was wasted. The scarcity of iron made it meaningful, and communities treated it with respect. Even simple iron objects carried emotional weight. They represented the tireless work of blacksmiths, the endurance of ancestors, and the ability of families to survive the harsh northern climate. Yet iron was not only useful, it also held symbolic value. People recognized its strength. They saw how it could bend and reshape reality. Over time, iron became associated with authority, craftsmanship, and sometimes even spiritual significance. Some believed that iron objects held protective powers. Archaeologists have discovered iron offerings placed in bogs, rivers, and other sacred sites. These offerings suggest that iron was not merely a tool, but a link between the human world and the unseen realms of spirits and ancestors. The people of the Iron Age did not separate the practical from the spiritual. Everything carried layers of meaning. Life around iron workshops had its own rhythm. The furnace glowed red in the dark, casting shadows across the ground. The smell of burning charcoal mixed with the scent of earth, metal, and sweat. Sparks danced in the air like tiny fire spirits. Apprentices, often young boys, watched closely, learning to pump bellows at the right pace and bring the iron to the correct temperature. They learned how to recognize the signs of good metal, its color, texture, and sound. The blacksmith instructed them calmly, his voice firm over the roar of fire. Every moment in the workshop was a lesson, every mistake an opportunity to learn. Ironwork was a craft defined by patience and attention, and those who practiced it developed a deep appreciation for the materials they shaped. Iron didn't only make life easier, it made life safer. Families could build stronger shelters that resisted storms and predators. Tools made daily tasks more efficient, giving people time to focus on other needs. Repairs became simpler. Travel became safer with iron-tipped spears or sturdy blades. The Iron Age wasn't just a technological era. It represented a shift in the way people interacted with their environment. The land was still powerful, but for the first time, people had a way to push back. Because iron allowed more effective farming, settlements slowly grew. With more food, families could support more children. With more tools, they could build larger structures or expand their fields. Iron's influence rippled across every aspect of society. Wealthier families often owned more iron objects, which elevated their status. Communities that mastered ironwork gained influence in broader trade networks. Iron goods traveled far beyond local regions, connecting different tribes and cultures through exchange. A clan known for its blacksmiths could gain respect, protection, and access to goods it otherwise would not have. Iron was both a practical resource and a social currency. Still, working with iron was dangerous. Furnaces needed constant tending, bellows could break, fires could get out of control. Blacksmiths regularly suffered burns, injuries, and lung problems from prolonged exposure to smoke. Yet despite the risks, they continued. They were essential. People depended on their skill not just for convenience, but for survival. A broken plow at the wrong time could mean a failed harvest. A damaged axe before winter could jeopardize firewood supplies. Blacksmiths were problem solvers in a world full of challenges. The introduction of iron also changed how communities planned their future. With iron axes and tools, families could clear more forest land, expand fields, and support larger herds. This expansion brought new opportunities but also new responsibilities. More land required more labor. More animals needed more fodder. With iron tools, families could build sturdier fences and stronger buildings, but they also needed to organize their lives around managing these resources. Iron improved life, but it did not eliminate hardship. Instead, it allowed people to aim higher, work more efficiently, and prepare better for the seasons ahead. Iron objects also traveled through trade networks that stretched far beyond Scandinavia. Amber from the Baltic coast, furs from the forests, and iron tools from the workshops moved southward across Europe through slow but steady channels of exchange. Traders brought back bronze ornaments, jewelry, pottery, and ideas from distant lands. Iron connected Scandinavia to a larger world long before the famous Viking expansions. It allowed the people of the north to participate, quietly but meaningfully, in the early webs of European commerce. As iron became more common, craftsmanship grew more refined. Decorative patterns appeared on weapons and tools. Handles were carved with care. In some cases, iron objects were combined with bone, wood, or antler to create beautiful and functional items. These were not simply tools, they were expressions of identity and pride. A finely forged knife was not just a blade, it was a symbol of a family's strength and a testament to the blacksmith's mastery. It might be given as a gift, passed down as an heirloom, or buried with someone important as part of their final journey. And yet, for all its transformative power, iron did not strip life of its difficulties. It helped people cut, build, plow, hunt, and defend, but the cold still arrived. Winters were still long, dark, and unforgiving. Tools could dull, weapons could break, and furnaces needed constant fuel. Iron did not grant freedom from nature's challenges, but it allowed people to face those challenges with greater skill, confidence, and resilience. It provided options where before there were none. In the deeper forests, far from the workshops, iron tools made the world more accessible. Hunters traveled farther, gathering meat and hides. They could carve paths, build traps, and shape bows more effectively. In coastal areas, iron knives and fishhooks made fishing more efficient. Families could gather larger catches, preserve them, and trade surplus fish for other goods. Iron became part of the unspoken contract between people and nature. It did not conquer the land, but it helped people negotiate with it. By the time generations passed, iron had become so deeply woven into daily life that it no longer felt new, it felt essential. People didn't marvel at the material itself, they focused on what it enabled. The children who grew up in this world knew iron only as the natural companion to wood, stone, and earth. They saw blacksmiths as familiar figures, workshops as ordinary structures, and tools as everyday necessities. Iron had become part of the cultural heartbeat of Scandinavia. The quiet power of iron shaped the trajectory of these northern communities. It laid the foundation for the technological advancements that would eventually give rise to shipbuilding, improved weaponry, and a level of craftsmanship that would later become legendary. But long before that, iron served ordinary families in ordinary ways, helping them plow their fields, chop their wood, protect their homes, and endure the punishing winters. It strengthened their resilience and sharpened their ability to work with the land rather than be defeated by it. Iron, in the end, was not just a metal. It was a companion, a teacher, and a tool of transformation. It helped shape the people who would one day carve their stories into history. Life in Iron Age Scandinavia 2,000 years ago required more than strength and instinct. It demanded a deep, inherited knowledge of how to build shelter that could withstand the brutal forces of the northern world. The people who lived through those winters, long, dark, and merciless, depended on structures that kept heat inside, kept predators outside, and made the difference between life and death. A home was much more than a place to sleep. It was the center of survival, a fortress of warmth, a workshop, a pantry, a barn, a gathering place, and in many ways, the heart of a community. Building such a place required planning, precision, and generations of collective wisdom. Nothing was wasted, nothing was improvised. Every beam, every stone, every patch of thatch represented a tradition older than memory. Imagine standing in an Iron Age settlement as the first frost settles over the land. The longhouses, low, wide structures made of timber, turf, and thatch, sit like sleeping beasts against the wind. Their walls curve slightly inward, shaped to resist storms that sweep in from the sea or roll across the forests. The roofs slope down nearly to the ground, thick with layers of straw, reeds, or sod. From a distance, these homes appear almost like part of the earth, as if grown rather than built. That was intentional. A building too exposed would lose heat. A roof too thin would collapse under snow. The people understood that harmony with nature was not poetic, it was survival. Constructing a longhouse began long before a single log touched the ground. First, a family had to choose the location wisely, high enough to avoid flooding, low enough to stay sheltered from icy winds, close to water but not too close to risk freezing spray, near forests for wood, and near fields for crops. This choice might involve the entire clan, elders, experienced men, and women who managed daily household tasks all contributed their knowledge. The future of a family depended on the decisions made in these early steps. Building too close to marshland would invite moisture into the house. Building too far from forests meant longer journeys for firewood in winter. Even the position of the sunrise mattered. Some houses oriented their main entrance toward the east, where morning light could reach the threshold during dark months. Once the site was chosen, clearing the land began. Men cut trees, not at random but selectively. They chose straight, strong pines or oaks for the frame, knowing which trees had grown tall without twisting fibers. The women and older children gathered stones for the foundation, while younger children collected small branches, bark, and roots that would later be used for insulation. Everyone participated. No hands were idle. In a world where a single week of delay could mean exposure to freezing winds, time was a resource even more precious than wood. When the trees were felled, the real work began. Shaping timber without modern tools was slow and demanding. Iron axes, still expensive and valuable, cut through the bark and carved the logs. The sound of sharp metal striking wood echoed across the land, a rhythm known in every settlement. Each beam was flattened slightly on one side to fit securely against the next. Men worked together to raise the heavy support posts, massive pieces of timber planted deep into the ground to anchor the house. These posts formed the spine of the structure, and they needed to be strong enough to last for decades. Building a longhouse was more than just construction. It was ceremony. As the first posts stood upright, families offered thanks to the spirits of the land, the ancestors, or the gods they believed guarded the home. These offerings varied. Sometimes grains were scattered into the earth. Sometimes a small carved object was buried beneath the threshold. Sometimes a drop of animal blood from a recent hunt was placed on one of the posts. These acts were not superstition to them. They were acknowledgments of the forces that governed their world. A house built without respect, they believed, might never truly become a home. With the frame in place, smaller logs and beams were added to form the walls and roof structure. Men climbed high, balancing on beams, securing poles with wooden pegs, or binding them with tightly twisted roots and fibers. The roof was built steep to allow snow to slide off, yet low enough that heat would not escape too easily. In the heart of a Scandinavian winter, warmth meant everything. A poorly built roof could allow cold drafts to creep in or let snow accumulate until the weight threatened collapse. They worked with precision, guided by techniques refined through centuries of harsh seasons. As the skeleton of the longhouse took shape, women prepared materials that would insulate and protect it. Thatch, collected during warmer months, was dried and sorted. Sod, blocks of living earth cut from grassy fields, was harvested carefully, each piece a natural insulator that trapped warmth. Birches were peeled for bark, which repelled water when layered properly. These materials were not simply convenient. They were chosen because they worked. A longhouse covered in sod became almost like a living thing, retaining heat from the fire and sheltering families like an insulated nest. A roof of thatch, properly woven and layered, could last years without leaking. The knowledge of how to bind thatch tightly, how to layer sod without gaps, how to seal cracks using moss and clay, these techniques were passed through generations, often taught by mothers to daughters as they worked side by side. Inside the longhouse, the layout followed a pattern shaped by necessity. The central hearth, The fire that burned almost constantly was the heart of the home. It warmed the air, cooked the food, dried wool and leather, and provided the only light during long winter nights. Families arranged their daily lives around it. Beds were placed along the walls, raised slightly from the ground to avoid the cold earth. Families slept close together, sharing warmth beneath layers of wool, fur, and woven blankets. Privacy was not a concept in the way we understand it today. Survival required closeness. The hearth itself was carefully constructed. Stones were arranged to contain the fire, and a smoke hole in the roof allowed smoke to escape, though it rarely worked perfectly. Longhouses were smoky places. Soot darkened the beams, clung to clothing, and irritated eyes, but smoke also served a purpose. It kept insects away, helped preserve meat hung in the rafters, and hardened the wooden beams overhead, making them more resistant to rot. People complained about the smoke, undoubtedly, but they understood its value. Everything in their homes served multiple roles. Storage was essential. The longhouse functioned as a warehouse of winter survival. Shelves lined the walls, holding clay pots filled with dried berries, herbs, grains, and preserved meats. Tools hung from beams, animal hides dried near the fire. Baskets of roots and vegetables were stacked carefully in cool corners. Nothing could be left outside during winter, so the interior often looked cluttered, but organized by necessity. Women managed this space, ensuring that food supplies were protected from moisture, pests, and mold. Their work inside the home was just as vital as the men's labor outside, and then there were the animals. In Iron Age Scandinavia, livestock meant life. Cows provided milk and warmth. Sheep provided wool and meat. Goats were hardy and could survive on limited grazing. During the coldest months, these animals were brought inside the longhouse, typically in a section near one end of the building. Their breath and bodies added heat to the space. Children tended to them, cleaning straw, sweeping manure, and ensuring each animal remained healthy. The line between household and barn blurred in winter. The smell, though strong, was accepted, another part of survival. Living so closely with animals also taught people how vulnerable they were. A sick cow might mean no milk. A dead sheep might mean no wool for clothing. These were not abstract losses. They affected every aspect of life. So the longhouse protected both humans and animals, creating a shared environment where cooperation with nature was constant and intimate. Winter brought its own changes to the house. Families prepared their longhouses to withstand snowstorms and freezing winds. Gaps in the walls were sealed with moss or clay. Extra layers of thatch or sod were added to the roof. Firewood was stacked high near the entrance. Tools were checked and repaired. The longhouse transformed into a fortress, one that had to hold strong against months of darkness. Outside, the world became silent, covered in snow. Inside, fires burned low and steady. The crackling of wood, the soft breathing of sleeping children, the shifting hooves of animals, these sounds became the soundtrack of winter life. But building a longhouse was not the end of the work. Maintenance never stopped. Roofs sagged under snow and had to be cleared. Walls shifted as frost affected the ground. Beams dried out and needed reinforcement. Families constantly checked their homes for weaknesses. A single storm could turn a minor crack into a serious threat. Imagine waking at night to the roar of a blizzard outside, hearing the wind batter the walls like a living force. In moments like that, the strength of the house determined whether the family saw spring again. Despite the hardships, there was comfort in these structures. They were warm, protective, and familiar. Children grew up learning every corner, every creaking beam, every patch where the breeze whispered through. Women cooked meals over the fire, weaving stories into the rising steam. Men returned from hunting or fishing, stamping snow from their boots, grateful for the shelter. Elders sat near the warmest corner, sharing tales of ancestors and gods. The longhouse was not just wood and earth. It was where identity was formed, where families connected, where culture lived. At night, when darkness swallowed the world outside, the firelight flickered on the faces gathered inside. Shadows danced across the walls, transforming the longhouse into a place of mystery and comfort. Children drifted to sleep listening to the murmur of adult voices. Dogs curled near the fire. The smell of smoke and wool filled the air. These homes, crude by modern standards, offered a sense of security that only those who lived through the northern winters could truly understand. As communities grew, some longhouses expanded. New sections were added, or new buildings were constructed near by workshops, small storage huts, or fenced areas for animals. But the longhouse remained the central pillar of life, the anchor of the settlement. Its durability was a testament to the skill and wisdom of the people. Many longhouses stood for decades. Some survived long enough for multiple generations to live within their walls. Building these structures shaped the rhythm of life. Men trained their sons in cutting timber, raising beams, and reading the land. Women taught their daughters how to weave thatch, store food, manage the hearth, and maintain the interior. Families worked together, strengthening bonds through shared effort. These homes were monuments to cooperation, resilience, and adaptation. Archaeologists today find remnants of these longhouses, post holes in the ground, bits of burned wood, layers of soil where floors once lay. From these traces, a picture emerges of communities that understood their environment with remarkable clarity. They knew how to harness the land's strengths and guard against its dangers. Their homes reflect a knowledge of engineering, insulation, fire management, and community life that was far more sophisticated than it might appear at first glance. In many ways, the longhouse was a physical representation of Iron Age Scandinavian society. Strong, adaptable, shaped by nature, built through collective effort, and capable of enduring the harshest conditions. The people who lived in these structures were not simply surviving. They were building a foundation for the cultures that would follow. Their methods, their craftsmanship, and their priorities shaped how later generations approached shelter, community, and resilience. The longhouse stood as a shield against winter, a gathering place for family, a workshop for daily labor, and a symbol of unity. It was at the center of every birth, every death, every celebration, every decision. To understand how people survived Iron Age Scandinavia, you must understand the longhouse, not only as a building, but as a reflection of who they were. Every log, every stone, every stitch of thatch carried the weight of their knowledge and the determination that allowed them to endure a world that offered nothing easily. Even today, the traces of these ancient homes evoke a quiet respect. Standing beside the faint outlines where a longhouse once stood, you can imagine the smoke rising from its hearth, the laughter of children inside, the hum of daily labor, the warmth that defied the northern cold. You can feel the presence of lives lived with strength and simplicity, carved into a landscape that demanded humility and unwavering effort. These homes, long vanished, remain powerful reminders of a people who built not just shelters, but legacies. Food and nutrition in Iron Age Scandinavia were not merely matters of taste or preference. They were the difference between life and death. A full stomach meant the strength to work, hunt, build, and endure the harsh winds that swept across the land. An empty stomach meant weakness, sickness, and dread, especially as winter tightened its grip and daylight vanished into endless nights. To survive 2,000 years ago in this cold northern world, people needed not only physical endurance, but an intimate understanding of the land's offerings. They needed to know when to gather, what to store, how to preserve, and which foods could last through the long dark months. Every bite they ate had a story behind it, shaped by the soil, the seasons, and centuries of inherited wisdom. Imagine a settlement in late summer when the earth is still generous. This is the season when families work from dawn until dusk, collecting everything they can before winter steals the warmth away. Women bend in the fields, pulling up turnips, onions, and hardy vegetables that have grown slowly under the northern sun. Children follow behind, carrying baskets woven from birch bark or willow branches. The air is filled with the scent of soil, fresh plants, and warm pine. These moments feel rich, almost luxurious, compared to the months that lie ahead. Every root and leaf matters. But although the work is long, there is satisfaction in knowing the harvest will feed the community when the landscape freezes solid. Grain was one of their most precious resources. Barley, rye, and sometimes oats were harvested from small, carefully tended plots. The yields were never large by modern standards, but they were vital. Grain meant bread, dense, heavy, and often slightly sour. It was not soft or fluffy. It was nourishment in its barest form, baked on stones or cooked as porridge. Bread accompanied nearly every meal, a symbol of endurance. Families stored grain in tightly sealed containers made of wood or clay, protecting it from moisture, rodents, and insects. Losing a supply of grain was a disaster. Guarding it was a responsibility shared by everyone. Vegetables played their part, but they could not be relied on alone. Iron Age Scandinavians needed fats and proteins to face their winters, and the land provided these in ways that blended effort with opportunity. Hunting was a respected skill, one that required patience, instinct, and courage. Men set out into the forests with bows, arrows, spears, and traps. They moved silently between trees, reading signs in the leaves and soil. A broken twig, a hoofprint in the mud, a distant rustle. These clues told them which animals had passed through. Deer, elk, wild boar, and smaller animals like hares and foxes shaped the rhythm of survival. A single successful hunt could feed a family for days. A single failure could force them to ration their stores more strictly. Hunting was never guaranteed. Snow could erase tracks. Animals could move unexpectedly. A storm could trap hunters miles from home, so the people learned to use every advantage they had. They built pit traps near animal trails, disguising them with branches and leaves. They set snares for birds and small mammals. They fished in rivers and lakes, using bone hooks, nets, and traps. Fishing was often more reliable than hunting. In summer, fish teemed in the cold waters: trout, salmon, pike, and cod. Each species had its season. Children learned to fish from an early age, developing skills that would help feed their families. But catching food was only half the battle. The greater challenge was preserving it. Fresh meat could not be kept for long, especially in the warmer seasons. So families dried, smoked, or salted it when possible. Smoking meat required the right wood, the right heat, and the patience to let it cure slowly. Hung above the hearth, strips of meat darkened over weeks, turning into something tough yet enduring. Dried fish, lightweight, long-lasting, became one of the most reliable foods during the cold months. Anyone who has spent a northern winter knows that it is not enough to gather food. One must outsmart the cold, darkness, and hunger that lurk quietly in every corner of daily life. Dairy products also played a major role. Cows, goats, and sheep were not kept for slaughter alone. Their milk allowed families to create cheese, butter, and fermented products that lasted far beyond the milking season. Cheese hardened into dense wheels that could survive months of storage. Buttermilk, sour and rich in nutrients, was a common drink. Butter was precious, used sparingly, cherished deeply. Livestock represented security, but caring for them required constant effort. Animals had to be fed, sheltered, and protected from predators. When winter arrived, they were brought inside the longhouse, their breath adding warmth to the air. Their importance extended far beyond food. They were part of the heartbeat of the home. Foraging was equally crucial. The people knew their forests intimately. They gathered berries, blueberries, lingonberries, cloudberries, each bursting with nutrients. each carefully stored for later use. Some berries were dried, others were preserved in honey when available. Herbs and medicinal plants were gathered during summer and hung in bundles inside the longhouse. Mushrooms, though riskier, were known and used by those who had the knowledge to distinguish safe varieties from deadly ones. Women learned these lessons from their mothers, who learned from theirs, each generation adding to the collective memory of the community. Honey, though rare, was treasured like gold. Beekeeping was not yet common, so honey came from wild hives found deep in the forests. It was used in celebrations, rituals, and sometimes to make mead, a fermented drink that brought warmth to cold nights and joy to gatherings. A hive discovered by a hunter was almost a gift from the gods. Honey meant energy, preservation, and sweetness in a world dominated by salt and smoke. Salt itself was a luxury. In many inland settlements it was scarce. People used ash, smoke, drying, and fermentation to preserve food when salt was unavailable. Along the coasts, salt could be gathered or traded, but even then, it was precious. A family with salt had an edge in survival. A family with too little had to get creative, or go without. Nuts were gathered from forests, hazel, nuts especially, cracked and eaten fresh or stored in clay pots. Roots like angelica, sorrel, and wild carrots added variety to meals. The land offered more than it seemed, but only to those who understood where to look, when to harvest, and how to prepare each thing safely. Knowledge of edible plants was as important as knowledge of weapons. Meals in an Iron Age settlement were simple but filling. A typical day might begin with porridge made from barley or oats, flavored with herbs or berries when available. Lunch might be fish stew, rich with onions or wild greens. Dinner might be roasted meat, dense bread, and preserved vegetables. Soups and stews were common. They stretched ingredients further, warmed the body, and allowed families to share limited resources. The hearth pot became a symbol of unity. Its contents reflected the entire community's efforts. Children grew up understanding food in a way that modern people rarely do. They learned the effort behind every meal, the gathering, the hunting, the fishing, the preserving. They learned the importance of not wasting anything. Bones were boiled to extract marrow, skins were used for clothing or tools, fat was used for lamps or cooking, even the smallest scraps found purpose. Wastefulness was not an option, it was dangerous. Winter changed everything. When snow blanketed the land, fresh food became scarce, rivers froze, forests grew silent, animals hid or migrated. People relied on their stored supplies, the dried meat, the smoked fish, the grains, the root vegetables kept in insulated pits or cool corners. Meals became repetitive but vital. Bread grew harder, soups grew thinner. Families rationed carefully, calculating how long the cold would last. In a harsh winter, the line between enough food and too little was razor thin. Some winters brought famine, some winters brought sickness. The people endured them with quiet determination, knowing that survival depended on discipline and preparation. In these months, the hearth became the center of existence. Women stirred pots slowly, stretching ingredients as far as possible. Men ventured out cautiously to check traps or hunt small game. Children helped grind grain, fetch water, or gather whatever firewood could be found under the snow. Even in hunger, the community worked together. Food was shared when necessary. No one could afford to let a neighbor starve. A weak family weakened the entire clan. Solidarity was more than kindness. It was strategy. Rituals connected food to spirituality. Before major meals, families often gave small offerings to the spirits or gods, perhaps a bit of grain, a slice of bread, or a drop of milk. These rituals reflected gratitude, fear, and respect. People knew how fragile their existence was. They believed that unseen forces influenced the success of hunts, the growth of crops, and the severity of winter. Making small sacrifices was their way of honoring the balance between survival and the unknown. Feasting existed too, though rarely, when a hunt was exceptionally successful, or when a child was born, or when a major seasonal milestone arrived. Communities came together for shared meals. These feasts were not extravagant by modern standards, but they were moments of joy. Roasted meats, fresh herbs, berries, cheese, and mead created meals that broke the monotony of daily survival. Around the fire, people shared stories, sang songs, and strengthened bonds. These moments mattered. They reminded everyone that survival was not simply about eating. It was about living. Trade brought variety to their diet when possible. Some settlements exchanged fish for grain, or hides for salt, or tools for dried herbs. Occasionally, traders from distant lands brought new flavors: honey, wine, spices, or unfamiliar grains. These were rare treats, often reserved for leaders, elders, or ritual events. But their presence hinted at the wide world beyond the forests and fjords, a world most people would never see but could imagine through taste. Food was also medicine. Women knew which plants could ease pain, reduce fever, help digestion, or treat wounds. Willow bark, known for its pain-relieving properties, was boiled into teas. Garlic and onions were used to fight infection. Certain roots were used to calm the stomach. Elderberries helped with cold symptoms. Every settlement had at least one person, a healer, often an older woman, who understood the deeper properties of plants. Her knowledge was essential, sometimes more valuable than grain itself. Eating together created connection. Families gathered around the hearth, passing wooden bowls, sharing from the same pot. Elders told stories of ancestors, teaching children through tales. Young ones learned patience, respect, and gratitude. In these shared moments, food became more than nourishment. It became memory. When spring finally returned and the first green shoots pushed through the melting snow, the relief was almost overwhelming. Fresh plants appeared: nettles, sorrel, birch leaves, providing nutrients long missing from winter diets. The first fish runs returned life to the rivers. Animals emerged from their hiding places. Spring food tasted vibrant, almost shocking compared to the preserved flavors of winter. The sensation of biting into fresh greens after months of dried roots was a reminder that life continues, that survival had meaning. Throughout the year, the people approached food with reverence, intensity, and deep practicality, not because they were obsessed with cuisine, but because they understood that food was woven into every part of existence. It was tied to weather, seasons, spirituality, family, and community. It taught discipline. It shaped identity. It forged resilience. 2,000 years later, when archaeologists uncover ancient cooking pits, charred grains, animal bones, or preserved berries in bogs, they catch glimpses of these ancient meals. Each discovery is a quiet echo of a life lived with purpose, shaped by the demands of a land both beautiful and brutal. The Iron Age Scandinavians were not feasting warriors or explorers yet. They were survivors who understood that every seed planted, every animal hunted, every pot stirred mattered. Their relationship with food tells a larger story, one of endurance, adaptation, and the quiet determination that built the foundations of future Scandinavian culture. Their meals may seem simple compared to modern cuisine, but in each bite was a testament to wisdom carved from the land and passed through generations. In the end, food was not simply sustenance. It was the silent force that allowed them to withstand the cold, outlast the hunger, and continue their story through centuries of unforgiving winters. Winter in Iron Age Scandinavia was not just a season. It was a force of nature that pressed itself into every aspect of life, a cold and relentless test that shaped the rhythms, fears, hopes, and identities of the people who lived 2,000 years ago. When the first frosts crept across the fields and the sunlight thinned into a pale, brief glow, families knew the world was shifting into its hardest form. They felt it in the animals, who grew restless as grazing disappeared. They felt it in the air, which carried the kind of cold that stung the lungs when inhaled. And they felt it in their bones, in memories passed down from elders who had survived harsh winters before them. These people lived with a simple truth. If you had not prepared enough by the time winter arrived, it was already too late. As autumn's final days came to a close, longhouses filled with activity. Women and older children gathered the last vegetables, storing them in pits dug deep into the earth where the temperature remained steady. Men repaired tools, checked the roofs for leaks, and reinforced walls with extra turf to hold in heat. Hunters returned with as much game as they could find: deer, hare, boar, knowing full well that in winter animals would become scarce. Everything, from a single carrot to a scrap of hide, mattered. There was no such thing as excess. There was only survival. When the first heavy snow fell, it muffled every sound, turning the world silent and still. Travel became dangerous. Paths disappeared beneath snowdrifts, and familiar landmarks were buried. Roads connecting settlements were no longer safe to walk without preparation or guidance. Only the most experienced hunters or messengers dared to travel between villages. For most families, winter meant isolation, weeks or even months of seeing only close kin, all tightly packed inside a longhouse where the fire burned day and night. Inside these longhouses, winter unfolded like a slow, grinding trial. The fire in the center never truly died, because letting it go out meant hours of struggle to relight it in freezing conditions. Families arranged their sleeping areas around the warmth, with the youngest and oldest closest to the center. These were the most vulnerable, the children who could lose heat too fast.